Jun-suk was the king of soul shadows, a man whose name silenced rooms, until an assassin's bullet shattered his spine and his dignity. He was sitting alone in a sea of judging whispers, drowning in the humiliation of a failed date, when a small voice pierced through his guarded shock. "Mister, does your chair go fast enough to catch the bad guys?" In the sterile luxury of a high-end restaurant, Kang Jun-suk, the paralyzed boss of a crumbling criminal empire, reaches his breaking point. Stood up by a woman meant to secure a political alliance and mocked by the smirks of the elite, Jun-suk is a predator trapped in a gilded cage. He is a man of tattoos, sharp white shirts, and a heart turned to stone. That is, until Casey Hamas and her twins walk in. Casey is a woman defined by quiet resolve, dressed in a simple pink blouse and holding the hands of her daughters, Dariana and Haley. She isn't there for the fine dining. She is there to return a lost wallet, hoping for a reward to keep the lights on in her cramped apartment. When her daughter's unfiltered curiosity shatters Jun-suk's icy exterior, a bridge is built between two impossible worlds. What begins as a moment of shared isolation quickly transforms into a desperate pact. When Casey is served an eviction notice that threatens her children's safety, Jun-suk offers her a lifeline, a role as his logistics coordinator. But in Jun-suk's world, logistics mean more than just schedules. It means surviving a landscape of internal betrayals, predatory rivals, and the shadow of the man who took his legs. As Casey's family fills his silent mansion with life, the lines between employer and protector vanish. Jun-suk must decide if he is willing to burn his old world to the ground to protect theirs. It is a story of a fallen king and a resilient mother discovering that while one was crippled by lead and the other by poverty, together, they are an empire that cannot be broken. The heavy crystal chandelier above table 12 hummed with a low, expensive vibration, but to Kang Jun-suk, it sounded like a funeral dirge. He adjusted his cufflink for the 10th time, the silk of his white shirt feeling like a restraint against his skin. Across from him, the chair remained empty, the white linen tablecloth mocking him with its pristine, undisturbed surface. He was 32 years old, a man who had once commanded the loyalty of 3,000 soldiers in the Seoul underworld, yet here he was, being dismantled by 30 minutes of silence. He caught his reflection in the darkened window of the restaurant. His sharp features were carved with a bitterness that had become his permanent mask since the accident. The neck tattoo that peeked above his collar, a coiled dragon meant to signify eternal power, now felt like a cruel joke. To the socialites whispering behind their menus at the far end of the room, he wasn't a king. He was a curiosity. He saw the way they glanced at the sleek, matte black frame of his wheelchair, and then quickly looked away, their eyes filled with that suffocating, saccharine pity that made his jaw tighten until it ached. The woman who was supposed to meet him, a daughter of a rival family meant to solidify a fragile truce, wasn't coming. She was likely laughing in some neon-lit club, mocking the broken tiger she had dared to stand up. Jun-suk's hand dropped to the joystick of his chair, his knuckles white. He was preparing to signal the waiter and vanish back into the shadows of his estate when the heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung open. It wasn't the sound of heels that changed the air, but the soft, rhythmic patter of small feet. Jun-suk turned his head with a guarded, sideways glance. A woman stepped into the golden light of the foyer, looking entirely out of place in the sea of designer gowns. She wore a simple pink blouse and jeans that had seen better days, her dark skin glowing warmly under the soft lighting. She looked exhausted, the kind of deep-seated weariness that came from fighting a war without an army, yet she carried herself with a quiet, unwavering resolve. In each hand, she held the palm of a small child, twins, identical in their blue dresses and their wide, wondering eyes. "I'm so sorry," the woman said, her voice calm but carrying a distinct edge of determination as she approached the host. "I know this isn't the kind of place people just walk into, but a lady dropped this outside the subway station. I saw her get into a car headed here." She held up a designer leather wallet. Jun-suk recognized it instantly. It belonged to the woman who had just humiliated him. The host began to usher them toward the door with a dismissive wave, but he was interrupted. One of the twins had let go of her mother's hand. With the fearless, unfiltered curiosity that only children possess, she wandered toward table 12. "Dariana, come back here," the mother whispered, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and worry. But the little girl was already standing in front of Jun-suk. She tilted her head, her gaze traveling from his sharp, tattooed neck down to the wheels of his chair. "Mister," she asked, her voice ringing out in the hushed room. "Does your chair go fast enough to catch the bad guys?" Jun-suk froze. His first instinct was to snap, to drive his chair past them and escape the scrutiny. But for the first time in 2 years, he wasn't looking into eyes full of pity or fear. He was looking at a child who saw his wheelchair as a vehicle of power, not a sign of weakness. "Dariana." Casey rushed forward, her hands landing gently on her daughter's shoulders. She looked at Jun-suk, her breath catching as she took in the expensive suit, the dangerous aura, and the empty table. She didn't look at his legs first. She looked at his eyes, dark, haunted, and profoundly lonely. "I am so incredibly sorry, sir. We didn't mean to bother your dinner." "Mama, look," the second twin, Haley, chirped as she joined her sister. "He has drawings on his neck, like the kings in my book." Jun-suk felt a strange, forgotten warmth stir beneath his ribs. He looked at Casey. Up close, he could see the slight fraying at her cuffs and the way she shielded her daughters with her own body. She was a woman living on the edge of survival, yet she was here, returning a wallet that likely contained more money than she saw in a month. "It's all right," Jun-suk said, his voice raspy from disuse. He gestured to the empty chair across from him with a slow, deliberate movement of his hand. "As you can see, I have more than enough room." "And your daughter?" She asked a very important question. He looked back at Dariana, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips, the first real expression he'd worn in months. "It goes fast enough," he told her quietly. "But sometimes, the bad guys are harder to catch than you'd think." Casey hesitated, her fingers tightening on the twins' shoulders. She saw the reserved sign on the table, the 2 glasses of untouched wine, and the crushing isolation that surrounded the man. She recognized that look because she saw it in her own mirror every morning. The look of someone who was doing everything right and still being left behind by the world. "I'm Casey," she said, her voice softening as she realized he wasn't going to lash out. "And these are my daughters. We'll leave you to your evening, mister." "Kong Jun-suk," he replied, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air between them feel suddenly, unexpectedly electric. "And please, stay. Just for a moment. It seems I've been stood up, and it would be a shame to let this much expensive food go to waste on a man who has forgotten how to enjoy it." Casey looked at her daughters, who were already staring at the breadbasket with hopeful eyes, then back at the man in the wheelchair. In that moment, the king of shadows and the single mother from the blocks found a common language in the silence of being alone. She pulled out the chair, the twins scrambling into the seat beside her, and as she sat, the icy walls Jun-suk had built around his heart didn't just crack, they began to melt. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the gray haze over the south side, casting long, tired shadows across the cracked pavement of Casey's neighborhood. From the tinted window of his armored SUV, Kong Jun-suk watched the landscape shift from the glass towers of the city center to a world of boarded-up brick and tangled power lines. His driver, a man named Min whose neck was as thick as his wrist, glanced in the rearview mirror with a concerned frown. They were far outside the safe zones of the syndicate, but Jun-suk remained unmoved, his eyes fixed on a specific, weathered 3-story walk-up. He held a thick envelope in his lap. Nominally, it was the reward for the wallet, but internally, Jun-suk knew it was an excuse. He hadn't been able to shake the memory of the woman from the restaurant, the way she had looked at him with neither the greed of his associates nor the pity of his enemies. "Wait here," Jun-suk commanded as the hydraulic lift lowered his wheelchair to the uneven sidewalk. The air here smelled of damp concrete and cheap gasoline, a sharp contrast to the filtered, cedar-scented air of his estate. As he maneuvered his chair toward the building, he saw Casey before she saw him. She was on the small patch of dead grass in front of the stairs, a heavy laundry basket balanced on one hip while she tried to untangle a retractable clothesline. Dariana and Haley were nearby, sitting on a threadbare blanket, playing a serious game of library with a stack of tattered books. Jun-suk paused, watching the rhythm of her movements. There was no wasted motion. She worked with a grim, efficient grace, her face set in a mask of concentration. When she reached up to pin a damp blue dress to the line, the fabric of her blouse pulled tight, revealing the lean muscle of her arms, the kind of strength that wasn't built in a gym, but through years of carrying the weight of 3 people on the shoulders of one. "You should use a sturdier line," Jun-suk said, his voice cutting through the distant sound of a passing siren. Casey spun around, her eyes widening as she recognized the man in the matte black chair. Her first instinct was defensive, a quick, sharp glance toward her daughters, before her expression settled into guarded surprise. "Mr. Kong, I didn't think I'd see you again, let alone here. I am a man who pays his debts, Casey," he said, moving closer until his chair reached the edge of the blanket. The twins erupted in excitement. "The spaceship man," Haley cried, abandoning her books to run toward him. She stopped just short of the wheels, remembering her mother's lessons on personal space, but her eyes were glowing. "Did you catch any bad guys last night?" "A few." Jun Suk lied softly, his heart doing a strange, uncomfortable stutter. Casey wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped toward him. She didn't apologize for the neighborhood or the peeling paint on her door. She stood tall, the wind catching the pink fabric of her shirt. "You didn't have to come all this way for a wallet. I did what anyone would do." "No," Jun Suk countered, holding out the envelope. "You did what a person of integrity does. In my world, that is a rare currency. This is the reward I promised." Casey looked at the envelope, then at his hands, strong, scarred hands that didn't belong to a man who lived a quiet life. She didn't reach for it immediately. "If there's too much in there, I can't take it." "I don't want charity, Mr. Kong." "It isn't charity. It's a transaction," he insisted. As they spoke, a group of local young men, their hoodies pulled low and their eyes sharp with predatory intent, stopped at the edge of the sidewalk. They eyed Jun Suk's expensive chair and the glint of his watch. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the air growing heavy with the threat of a confrontation. Jun Suk's hand hovered near the armrest of his chair, his eyes turning into flint. He was ready to whistle for men, ready to remind the world why the name Kong Jun Suk was whispered in terror. But Casey didn't flinch. She stepped into the space between Jun Suk and the street, her posture shifting from mother to protector. She didn't shout. She simply stared the men down with a look of such absolute, bone-deep authority that they hesitated. She had lived here long enough to know the language of the streets, and she had survived it by being the one thing they couldn't break. The men muttered something under their breath and moved on. Casey exhaled, a small tremor in her hands that she quickly hid by taking the envelope. "You have a different kind of power, Casey," Jun Suk murmured, genuinely impressed. "You fight for this every day?" "Every single day," she said quietly, looking back at her daughters. "But the world doesn't care how hard you fight if you can't pay the rent. Thank you for this. It buys us a little more time." Jun Suk looked at the building behind her, a fortress of necessity, and then at the woman who held it together with nothing but her own resolve. He felt a sudden, violent surge of loathing for his own life of empty luxury. He saw her quiet strength, the way she managed to keep her daughters' dresses clean and their eyes bright in a place designed to dim them. He realized then that Casey Hamas wasn't just a woman who had returned a wallet. She was a soldier in a war he had never understood, and for the first time in his life, Kong Jun Suk wanted to be on the winning side of a battle that actually mattered. "Time is expensive," Jun Suk said, his mind already beginning to turn, the wheels of his ambition shifting toward a new, unexpected goal. "But perhaps there is a way to buy more than just a few weeks." The fluorescent lights of the diner's back office flickered with a rhythmic, dying buzz that matched the sinking feeling in Casey's chest. Her manager, a man whose soul seemed as greasy as the grill out front, wouldn't even look her in the eye. He kept his gaze fixed on the termination slip, mumbling about restructuring and unreliable hours, which Casey knew was code for her having to leave early twice last week when Haley had a fever. "I have 2 daughters, Bill," Casey said, her voice dropping to that dangerous, low register of a woman who was done being polite to the undeserving. "I've never missed a shift that I didn't make up in double time." "It's just business, Casey," he grunted, finally sliding the final paycheck across the desk. It was a pathetic sliver of paper, barely enough to cover the grocery bill, let alone the back rent that loomed like a shadow over her front door. Casey walked out into the humid afternoon air, the weight of the silence in her pockets feeling heavier than any lead. She stood on the sidewalk, the city noise swirling around her, and for a split second, the composure she wore like armor threatened to crack. She had $47 in her purse, a final check that wouldn't clear until Friday, and 2 little girls who expected dinner and a bedtime story. She was so lost in the mental math of survival that she didn't notice the black SUV idling at the curb until the window slid down. "The world has a habit of failing those who deserve its help the most," a familiar, gravelly voice said. Jun Suk sat in the back, the dim interior of the vehicle making his sharp features look like a portrait in charcoal. He looked at the slip of paper trembling slightly in her hand, then up at her face. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. In his world, People were discarded the moment their utility was outweighed by their inconvenience. "Get in, Casey," he said. It wasn't a suggestion, but it wasn't a threat either. It was an opening. Casey hesitated, her pride warring with the cold reality of the eviction notice waiting at home. She looked at the armored door, then back at the diner she'd just been exiled from. She climbed in, the scent of expensive leather and cool, filtered air enveloping her like a different dimension. "I don't need a ride to a pity party, Mr. Kong," she said, staring straight ahead as the car pulled into traffic. "Good, because I don't host them," Jun-suk replied, his gaze fixed on the passing city. "I've spent the last few days reviewing my estate's operations. My current staff is competent at their tasks, but they lack a certain loyalty. They lack the eyes of someone who understands what is at stake when things fall apart." He turned his head toward her, his dark eyes searching hers. "I am in need of a logistics coordinator, someone to manage the household, oversee the security schedules, and ensure that the private affairs of the Kong estate remain exactly that, private. It is a position of high trust, high pressure, and," he paused, sliding a folder toward her, "significant compensation." Casey opened the folder. Her breath hitched. The base salary alone was more than she had earned in the last 3 years combined. It included full health coverage for her and the twins, and a residency clause at the estate's guest wing. "Why me?" she whispered, the numbers blurring before her eyes. "You have people with degrees and backgrounds for this. I'm just a woman who returned a wallet. You are a woman who stared down 4 armed thugs to protect a stranger." Jun-suk corrected, his voice dropping an octave. "You are a woman who keeps her word when it costs her everything. I can buy expertise, Casey. I can't buy the kind of steel you have in your spine." He leaned closer, the movement restricted but his presence overwhelming. "My world is dangerous. There are people who see my chair and think I am a fallen king they can scavenge. I need a gatekeeper who knows how to spot a predator because she's been surviving them her whole life. And in return, your daughters will never know the sound of a landlord's knock again." Casey looked out the window. She saw the twins in her mind's eye, playing on that threadbare blanket on the dead grass, surrounded by the ghosts of a neighborhood that wanted to swallow them whole. She thought about this spaceship man and the way he'd looked at her daughters, not as distractions, but as lives worth protecting. She wasn't just choosing a job. She was choosing a side in a war she barely understood, but as she looked at Jun-suk, she saw a man who was just as isolated in his fortress as she was in her poverty. "I have conditions," Casey said, her voice regaining its iron. "My daughters come with me. They are never to be used as leverage. And I work for you, Mr. Kong, not your organization. I don't want my girls seeing the shadows you keep." A rare, genuine smile ghosted across Jun-suk's lips. "Agreed. You will be the light that keeps the shadows at bay. Do we have a deal?" Casey looked at his hand, the strong, scarred hand of a man who had reached out to her in her darkest hour. She took it, her grip firm and certain. "We have a deal." As the SUV turned toward the affluent heights of the city, leaving the south side in the rearview mirror, Casey felt the first flutter of hope she'd allowed herself in years. She didn't know that she had just stepped into a minefield, but as she glanced at Jun-suk, she realized that for the first time, she wouldn't have to walk through it alone. The gates of the Kong estate didn't just open. They retreated, heavy wrought iron sliding back with a silent, mechanical precision that made Casey feel as though she were entering a sovereign nation. As the SUV wound up the long, tree-lined drive, the twins pressed their faces against the glass, their breath fogging the windows. The mansion loomed ahead, a monolith of cold stone, glass, and sharp angles, perched on the hillside like a hawk watching the city below. When the doors opened, the silence of the house hit Casey first. It was a heavy, curated silence, the kind that existed only in places where life had been replaced by a meticulous arrangement of expensive things. The air smelled of beeswax, old books, and the faint, metallic tang of ozone from the high-end security systems. "Is this a castle, Mama?" Dariana whispered, her voice barely a thread in the cavernous foyer. "It's a home, baby," Casey said, though she didn't quite believe it yet. She gripped their hands tighter, her own heels clicking rhythmically against the polished obsidian floors, a sound that seemed to echo into infinity. Jun-suk was waiting for them in the center of the hall, his wheelchair positioned beneath a massive, minimalist painting that looked like a splash of ink on a white canvas. In the harsh afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he looked less like a victim of an accident and more like a commander on his bridge. His white shirt was crisp, his gaze level and expectant. "Welcome to the fortress, Casey," he said. His eyes shifted to the twins, and the hardness in his expression flickered, just for a second. And to you too as well. I believe your quarters are ready. The culture clash began the moment the twins were released from Casey's grip. To Jun-suk's staff, men in dark suits who moved like shadows and maids who worked with downcast eyes, the mansion was a temple of order. To Dariana and Haley, it was a playground of impossible proportions. The sound of their laughter, high-pitched and chaotic, ripped through the stillness like a physical force. Haley's light-up sneakers clicked and flashed as she chased her sister toward a long hallway lined with ancient pottery. A security guard instinctively stepped forward to intercept them, his face a mask of professional annoyance, but a single, sharp raise of Jun-suk's hand froze him in place. Let them be, Jun-suk commanded. The house hasn't heard a sound like that in a decade. It's overdue. Casey followed Jun-suk as he led her toward the east wing. The transition was jarring. They passed through rooms filled with priceless artifacts and state-of-the-art surveillance monitors, only to arrive at the guest suite that had been transformed into their new world. Jun-suk had been thorough. The rooms were warm, filled with soft textures and bright colors that clashed violently with the rest of the mansion's monochromatic soul. There were new toys, bookshelves filled with stories, and windows that looked out over a private garden. You did all this? Casey asked, running a hand over a velvet armchair. In 24 hours? My organization is built on efficiency, Casey, Jun-suk replied, maneuvering his chair to the window. But I realized I didn't have anything in this house that a child would want to touch. It felt wrong. As the afternoon bled into evening, the fortress began to change. The kitchen, usually a place of silent meal preparation for a solitary man, became a battlefield of spilled apple juice and the twins' demands for the red grapes, not the green ones. The stone hallways, once used only for the hum of a wheelchair and the hushed reports of bodyguards, now echoed with the twins playing hide-and-seek behind heavy velvet curtains. Casey watched from the doorway of the study as Jun-suk sat at his massive desk, trying to review shipping manifests, while Dariana sat on the floor near his wheels, meticulously organizing her colored pencils by shade. Every so often, Jun-suk would glance down, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. He wasn't used to being watched by eyes that expected nothing but a story or a smile. They're making too much noise, Casey said softly, leaning against the doorframe. I can take them to the garden. Jun-suk didn't look up from his screen, but his hand reached out, his fingers brushing the top of Dariana's head almost tentatively. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability, a king acknowledging a subject he didn't know how to rule. The noise is fine, Casey, he murmured. It's the silence I'm tired of. The silence reminds me of what I lost. The noise, it reminds me of what's left. He finally looked at her, and in the dim light of the study, the dangerous king of shadows looked remarkably human. He was a man who had built a wall of steel and glass to keep the world out, only to realize he'd trapped himself inside. You should get some rest, he said, his voice regaining its professional clip. Tomorrow, your work begins. My schedule is a disaster, and I have a feeling you're the only one who can fix it. Casey nodded, calling the twins to her. As she led them away, she heard the low hum of Jun-suk's chair as he turned back to his monitors. The mansion was still dark, and the shadows were still long, but as Dariana's sleepy laughter echoed one last time through the hall, Casey realized the fortress wasn't just a place of protection anymore. It was a place of transformation. She had come here to save her daughters from the streets, but as she looked back at the lone man in the center of all that cold stone, she realized she might have been hired to save him, too. The black silk of Casey's evening gown felt like a second skin, elegant and heavy, a stark departure from the faded denim she had worn only weeks ago. As she stood before the mirror in the east wing, she barely recognized the woman looking back. Her hair was swept up in a sophisticated coil, and the twins, dressed in matching navy velvet, stood behind her like two little guards. Jun-suk had insisted on this, a public appearance at the annual Metropolitan Charity Gala. It was a strategic move, a way to signal that he was no longer a hermit hiding in a fortress, but Casey knew it was also a gamble. When they arrived at the grand ballroom of the Grand Hyatt, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of old money. Jun-suk sat in his chair, his white shirt replaced by a charcoal gray tuxedo that made his neck tattoo look like a mark of ancient royalty rather than a street brand. He didn't lead with his disability, he led with his presence. Every head turned as the hydraulic lift of his vehicle lowered him to the red carpet, and Casey felt the weight of 1,000 gazes. Keep your head up, Jun-suk murmured as they moved through the crowd. They are looking for a crack in the armor. Don't give it to them. The evening was a dance of polite hostility. Casey managed the twins with one hand and Jun-suk's social schedule with the other, introducing herself as his logistics coordinator with a calm that she didn't entirely feel. She saw the way the elite of the city whispered behind their champagne flutes, their eyes darting between Jun-suk's wheelchair and the two young black girls who were currently marveling at a towering ice sculpture of a swan. The snake in the grass appeared near the auction block. Park Min-ho, Jun-suk's former second-in-command and a man with a smile as sharp as a razor, stepped out from the shadows of a velvet pillar. He was younger, his legs strong, his stance wide and arrogant, a deliberate contrast to Jun-suk. Jun-suk, Min-ho drawled, his voice a smooth, dangerous silk. I heard you had acquired some domestic interests. I didn't realize the rumors were true. He didn't look at Jun-suk. He looked at Casey, his eyes trailing over her with a predatory slowness that made her skin crawl. Then, his gaze dropped to the twins. Dariana was reaching out to touch the ice, her fingers just inches from the swan. Careful, little one, Min-ho said, stepping closer to the children. Ice is cold. It breaks easily if you put too much weight on it. Much like empires. The atmosphere at the table froze. Jun-suk's hand tightened on the joystick of his chair, the electric motor giving a low, warning hum. Min-ho, I wasn't aware this event invited street dogs. Perhaps the security is slipping. Min-ho laughed, but his eyes remained cold. The world is changing, Jun-suk. People are starting to wonder if the King of Shadows has traded his sword for a rattle. Bringing a family into this, it's a vulnerability. A target. He reached out a hand, as if to pat Haley's head, but Casey was faster. She stepped into the narrow space between the rival boss and her daughter, her posture straight, her eyes boring into his. She didn't have a weapon, and she didn't have a title, but she had the ferocity of a mother who had survived the South Side's hardest winters. Mr. Park, is it? Casey's voice was low, carrying a rhythmic authority that cut through the gala's ambient noise. In my neighborhood, men who talk too much about what other people might lose are usually the ones who have nothing of their own to protect. It makes them look desperate. Min-ho's smile faltered. The socialites nearby leaned in, sensing a shift in the power dynamic. To see a woman in a simple gown speak to a known enforcer with such absolute lack of fear was a spectacle they hadn't expected. Jun-suk's eyes glinted with a dark, prideful amusement. He moved his chair forward, the matte black frame bumping gently against Min-ho's expensive shoes, a silent assertion of territory. She's right, Min-ho, Jun-suk said, his voice dropping into a register that made the surrounding air feel heavy. You see a vulnerability. I see a reason to make sure anyone who crosses my threshold never walks out again. Don't mistake my chair for a throne you can sit in. It's a vantage point. And from here, I can see exactly where your throat is. Min-ho straightened his tie, his face darkening. He looked at Casey one last time, a gaze that promised this wasn't an isolated encounter, before vanishing back into the crowd. As they made their way to the exit an hour later, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold realization. The twins were sleepy, Haley's head resting against Casey's shoulder as they waited for the car. The gala had been a success in terms of visibility, but the snake had seen exactly what Jun-suk loved. You shouldn't have stepped in like that, Jun-suk said quietly as they settled into the back of the SUV. Min-ho is a man with no conscience. And I'm a woman who doesn't tolerate threats to her children, Casey replied, her gaze fixed on the passing city lights. She turned to him, her expression a mix of resolve and burgeoning fear. He's going to come for us, isn't he? Jun-suk reached out, his hand covering hers. His grip was firm, a promise of iron and silk. Let him try. He thinks he found my weakness, Casey. He has no idea, he just found the only thing that could make me truly dangerous again. In the silence of the car, Casey realized the fortress was no longer just a home. It was a bunker. And as she looked at Jun-suk's tattooed neck, she knew the war for their future had officially begun. The morning light in the conservatory was soft and hazy, filtering through the high glass panes to illuminate the low table where Dariana and Haley sat cross-legged. Between them, Jun-suk sat in his chair, his usual black tablet replaced by a stack of oversized flashcards with bold Hangul characters. The silence of the mansion was gone, replaced by the rhythmic, melodic sounds of the girls trying to wrap their tongues around the foreign syllables. No, Haley, listen to the air, Jun-suk said, his voice unusually patient. He leaned forward, pointing to a character. Can be you. It means someone you share everything with. A best friend. Gambiyu. The twins echoed in unison, their voices bright and high. Dariana giggled, reaching out to trace the lines of the character with her finger. Like you and us? She asked, looking up at him with the unflinching honesty of a child. Junsuk hesitated. The word felt heavy in the air, a promise of loyalty that he hadn't shared with anyone since the bridge collapsed beneath his car. He looked at the twins, their faces open and trusting, and then at Casey, who stood in the doorway with a tray of sliced fruit. Yes, he murmured, his dark eyes softening. Like us. Casey set the tray down, her gaze lingering on the sight of the feared King of Shadows, acting as a tutor. The tension from the gala still hummed in the background of their lives, but here, in this pocket of quiet, the danger felt miles away. Yet, she knew the physical toll the stress was taking. She had seen him grimacing when he thought no one was looking. His hands massaged his unresponsive thighs with a frustration that bordered on rage. It's time, Jun-suk, she said softly. The twins were ushered out to the garden with a nanny, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The light-heartedness vanished, replaced by the clinical, grueling reality of Jun-suk's daily struggle. They moved to the therapy room, a space filled with specialized bars, pulleys, and a padded table that Jun-suk usually entered alone, barring even his most trusted men from witnessing his failure. But today he had asked Casey to stay. The session was brutal. Jun-suk's face was slick with sweat within minutes, his white shirt clinging to his back as he used a set of overhead straps to pull his torso upright. Casey stood by his side, her heart aching as she watched him tremble with the sheer effort of a movement that a child could do without thinking. I can't. The connection is dead, Jun-suk hissed through clenched teeth, his head dropping forward in exhaustion. It's just meat and bone now, Casey. There's nothing left. There is more than just nerves, Jun-suk, Casey said, her voice steady and firm. She stepped closer, breaking the unspoken rule of his personal space. She reached out, her warm hands settling over his ankles. Jun-suk flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing past his lips. He looked at her hands against his skin, dark against pale, soft against scarred. It was the first time someone had touched him not as a patient and not as a target, but as a man. What are you doing? He asked, his voice shaking with a mix of vulnerability and pride. Reminding your body that it isn't alone, Casey replied. She began to move his legs in a slow, cycling motion, her touch deliberate and rhythmic. You spend all your time in your head, Jun-suk. You think you're just a brain in a chair, but you're still here. All of you. She looked up at him, and the distance between them vanished. The barrier of touch had been broken, and with it, the emotional wall he had spent 2 years reinforcing. Jun-suk reached down, his hand covering hers as she held his knee. His grip was tight, desperate, as if he were trying to pull the life from her palms into his own. They call me a broken tiger, he whispered, the admission tearing from him like a confession. Minho, the council, they wait for me to stumble so they can finish the job. I can't be weak, Casey. I don't know how to be anything else. Strength isn't just about standing on your own 2 feet, Casey said, her thumbs tracing the line of his muscle. I've spent my whole life being strong because I had no choice. But the strongest thing I ever did was return that wallet when I was starving. The strongest thing you ever did was let us into this house. That's not weakness. That's courage. Jun-suk looked at her, and for a moment, the boss, the tattoos, and the wheelchair didn't exist. There was only a man who had been drowning in bitterness and a woman who had spent her life learning how to swim. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet room. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was shared. Gambiyu, he murmured, the word he had taught the twins earlier. Casey closed her eyes, her hands still resting on his legs. Gambiyu, she repeated. The physical pain hadn't vanished, and the rivals at the gate hadn't gone away. But as they sat there in the fading light of the therapy room, the fortress felt less like a prison and more like a foundation. Jun-suk had spent years building an empire on fear, but in the simple, steady touch of a woman who refused to pity him, he was beginning to build something far more dangerous to his enemies, a reason to fight for a life he had once tried to throw away. The air in the boardroom of the Kong estate was thick with the scent of bitter coffee and the underlying coldness of a shifting hierarchy. Jun-suk sat at the head of the obsidian table, his eyes tracking the nervous movements of the 4 district lieutenants who had requested this emergency briefing. They spoke of supply chain disruptions and territorial friction, but Jun-suk could hear the hollow ring of a lie in every sentence. His intuition, sharpened by years of navigating the predatory waters of Seoul, was screaming. The park organization isn't just probing our borders, boss, the youngest lieutenant said, his eyes darting toward the closed double doors. They're looking for the soft spot. Jun-suk's fingers tapped a rhythmic, deadly beat on the armrest of his chair. There are no soft spots in this house. Only places where the steel is hidden. Suddenly, his phone, resting face up on the table, vibrated with a frantic persistence. It was a private internal alert, the nursery wing. His heart didn't just race, it turned to lead. He swiped the screen to see a live feed from the garden monitors. The image was a chaotic blur. The twins' nanny was on the ground, and two men in tactical gear were dragging a screaming Haley toward the perimeter wall. Dariana was clinging to her sister's waist, her small blue dress fluttering like a distressed flag. "Men!" Jun-suk roared, his voice cracking the curated silence of the room. The heavy doors burst open, but it wasn't his loyal driver. It was three more of Minho's men, suppressed pistols drawn. The lieutenants at the table scrambled back, their betrayal finally naked in their fearful eyes. They had sold the broken tiger for a seat at the new table. "You're done," Jun-suk, one of the traitors hissed. "Let the girls go with them, and maybe we'll let you stay in this chair for another hour." Jun-suk didn't flinch. In the face of a direct threat, the bitterness that had clouded his mind for 2 years evaporated, replaced by the cold, calculating precision of the man who had built an empire from nothing. He wasn't a victim of an accident anymore. He was the king of shadows, and they had just touched his soul. With a movement too fast for the traitors to track, Jun-suk hit a sequence of keys on the encrypted console built into his wheelchair. The room's lights died instantly, replaced by the ominous, red glow of emergency lockdown. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over the windows and doors, trapping the traitors inside with the man they had underestimated. "You think I'm trapped in here with you?" Jun-suk's voice came out of the darkness, low and carrying a resonance that made the air vibrate. "I've spent 2 years in this chair learning how to turn a house into a weapon." From the hidden compartments of his chair, he didn't pull a gun. He pulled a remote terminal. He wasn't going to fight them with his legs. He was going to fight them with the absolute control he had over the fortress. High-frequency acoustic emitters, hidden in the crown molding, let out a piercing, disorienting shriek. The gunmen dropped their weapons, clutching their ears in agony. Outside in the garden, Casey had heard the commotion from the kitchen. She didn't wait for the security team that had been compromised. She grabbed a heavy iron fire poker and sprinted toward the garden, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She saw the men reaching for Haley. "Get away from them," she screamed, her voice a raw, primal roar. She swung the iron with the desperate, terrifying strength of a mother, catching one kidnapper across the shoulder. Through the garden speakers, Jun-suk's voice boomed, calm, authoritative, and deadly. "Casey, drop to the ground." Now, Casey didn't hesitate. She threw herself over the twins, shielding their small bodies with her own. A split second later, the estate's non-lethal deterrent system, a grid of high-pressure stun gas vents, erupted along the perimeter wall. The kidnappers were engulfed in a cloud of incapacitating vapor, collapsing like puppets with cut strings. Inside the boardroom, the red light flickered over Jun-suk's face, highlighting the dragon tattoo on his neck. He looked at the lieutenants, who were now groveling on the floor, their ears bleeding from the acoustic assault. He didn't look broken. He looked like a god of vengeance. "Minho thought my family was a vulnerability," Jun-suk whispered, maneuvering his chair over the hand of the man who had insulted the girls. The motor hummed with a heavy, industrial power. He forgot that a man with something to lose is the only man you should truly fear. He patched through to Min, who had finally regained control of the outer security gate. "Secure the girls. Get Casey inside. And Min, tell the cleaners to come to the boardroom. We have a lot of trash to move." 10 minutes later, the mansion was back in a state of terrifying, silent order. Jun-suk found Casey and the twins in the foyer. They were shaking, Haley's blue dress torn at the hem, Dariana's hair a mess of tangles. Casey looked up at him, her eyes wide with the realization of what kind of world she had truly entered. The logistics were no longer just schedules. They were a tally of survivors. "They tried to take them, Jun-suk," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jun-suk moved his chair close, his hands reaching out to pull the twins into his lap. He held them with a tenderness that shouldn't have belonged to a man who had just dismantled a coup. He looked up at Casey, his expression a vow written in blood and iron. "They will never get that close again," he promised. "I spent 2 years waiting for my legs to heal, so I could be a man. Today, I realized I don't need them to be a monster for anyone who touches you. Casey reached out, her fingers brushing his tattooed neck. She saw the dangerous past in his eyes, but she also saw the bright future he was willing to burn the world to protect. She didn't pull away. She leaned into him, the four of them forming a single, unbreakable knot in the center of the cold, stone hall. The war was no longer in the shadows. It was on their doorstep, and for the first time, they were ready to fight it together. The aftermath of the failed kidnapping left a lingering scent of ozone and iron in the air of the estate, but for Jun-suk, the clarity was absolute. He sat in his study, the room illuminated only by the cold, blue light of 6 different computer monitors. On the screens, the lifeblood of the Kong organization, encrypted ledgers, shipping manifests, and offshore accounts, flowed in a digital river. Beside him, Casey stood like a silent sentinel, her hand resting on the back of his chair. They hadn't spoken much since the garden had been cleared, but the shared pulse of their resolve was stronger than words. Minho thinks this is a street war, Jun-suk murmured, his fingers flying across a specialized keyboard. He thinks he can win with more soldiers and louder guns. He's forgotten that in the 21st century, an empire isn't built on bricks, it's built on data. What are you doing, Jun-suk? Casey asked, her eyes tracking the rapidly scrolling code. I'm burning the bridges, he replied. But I'm not just destroying my enemies. I'm destroying the path back to who I was. With a single, decisive keystroke, Jun-suk initiated a scorched earth protocol he had spent months developing in the lonely hours of his recovery. Across the city, in the high-rise offices of his rivals and the backroom dens of the Syndicate Council, panic began to spread. Digital wallets containing millions in untraceable currency began to drain into charitable foundations for pediatric health and urban renewal. Encrypted files detailing the corrupt dealings of the city's elite, the very people who had smirked at Jun-suk's wheelchair at the gala, were funneled into the secure servers of the Federal Investigative Bureau. Jun-suk wasn't just fighting. He was performing a clinical amputation. By the time the sun began to peek over the Chicago skyline, the Kong organization's criminal assets no longer existed. The King of Shadows had liquidated his throne. The final bridge was Park Minho. As the morning fog rolled in, a secure video link chirped on Jun-suk's center screen. Minho appeared, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and terror. Behind him, the sounds of shouting and the heavy thud of battering rams echoed. The authorities were at his door, armed with the evidence Jun-suk had just gifted them. You've killed us all. Minho screamed, his eyes wild. You've destroyed everything we built. Do you think they'll let you walk away just because you turned informant? I didn't turn informant, Minho, Jun-suk said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. I turned legitimate. Every asset I kept is tied to legal shipping, tech, and real estate. You stayed in the gutter, looking for a way to trip a man in a chair. I spent my time learning how to own the street itself. Jun-suk leaned forward, his sharp features caught in the screen's glow. The organization is dead. The council is in handcuffs. And you're a relic. I'm leaving the shadows, Minho. Try not to drown in them. He cut the feed before Minho could respond. The silence that followed was different from the heavy, oppressive quiet of the mansion's past. This was the silence of a clean slate. Jun-suk turned his chair toward Casey. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes deeper than ever, but the bitterness that had defined him was gone. He looked at his hands, the hands that had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar criminal network without firing a single shot. It's done, he said. The King of Shadows is dead. All that's left is a man in a chair with a very capable logistics coordinator. Casey let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since the day they met at the restaurant. She moved around the desk, kneeling beside his chair the way she had during their therapy sessions. She took his hands in hers, her warmth grounding him. You really did it. You chose us. I chose a life where I don't have to look at my daughters and wonder if they're safe because of my name or in spite of it, Jun-suk whispered. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. I realized that my mind was never paralyzed, Casey. Only my heart was. And you fixed that. Outside, the twins' laughter began to rise from the garden, a sound that was now a permanent fixture of the estate. They were safe. The fortress was no longer a bunker, it was a home. Jun-suk had proven that his mind was indeed his deadliest weapon, but as he looked at Casey, he knew that his love was his greatest strength. He had burned the bridges to his past, and in the ashes, he was finally free to walk toward a future he had never dared to imagine. He wasn't a fallen king anymore. He was a man starting over, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the journey. The crystal chandelier at table 12 still hummed with that same expensive vibration, but the sound no longer resembled a funeral dirge. Tonight, it felt like a spotlight on a life reclaimed. Kong Jun-suk sat in his matte black chair, his white shirt crisp and his charcoal blazer tailored to perfection. He looked down at the table, but he didn't check his watch. He didn't have to. The seat across from him wasn't empty, and the silence that had once been his only companion had been replaced by the beautiful, chaotic symphony of a family. "Mama, Haley is stealing my fries." Dariana's voice rang out, bright and clear, cutting through the hushed atmosphere of the high-end restaurant. "I'm not stealing. I'm logistically relocating them," Haley countered with a mischievous grin, throwing a wink at Jun-suk. She had picked up his vocabulary with frightening speed over the last year, her blue dress shimmering under the golden lights as she giggled. Casey sat to Jun-suk's right, looking radiant in a deep emerald silk dress that complemented the warmth of her skin. She didn't look like a woman drowning in survival anymore. She looked like a queen who had helped build a new kingdom. She caught Jun-suk's eye and smiled, a slow, private smile that spoke of shared battles and quiet victories. She reached under the table, her hand finding his knee and resting there with a steady, grounding weight. "The girls are going to get us kicked out of here, Jun-suk," Casey whispered, though there was no real worry in her voice. "Let them try," Jun-suk replied, his voice a low, resonant rumble of contentment. "I own the building now, and besides, the staff has never seen this table so full." He looked around the room, but his gaze didn't linger on the shadows or the exits. He didn't give a guarded, sideways glance to the socialites who were still whispering. They were still there, of course, the curious and the judgmental, but their opinions had lost their sting. Jun-suk realized that the pity he had once felt like knives against his skin was merely the noise of people who didn't understand that a man's worth wasn't measured by the strength of his legs, but by the depth of his peace. The waiter approached, the same one who had smirked a year ago. Now, his posture was straight, his eyes full of genuine respect as he set down a platter of Korean delicacies and a side of perfectly golden fries. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Kong?" "Ms. Hamas." "Just a story," Dariana piped up, looking at Jun-suk. "The one about the king who didn't need a horse because he had a spaceship." Jun-suk laughed, a real, chest-deep sound that made a few patrons turn in surprise. He reached out, his hand covering Casey's on his leg, and then looked forward. He wasn't the king of shadows anymore, hiding in the dark and ruling through fear. He was something new. He was a man who had traded an empire of ghosts for a home full of laughter. He looked at the twins, who were busy teaching their stuffed Mr. Hoppy how to use chopsticks, and then at Casey, whose eyes held everything he had ever needed. He realized that the accident hadn't been the end of his